introduce it just over the next few minutes. We'll also hear a brief word from the Ireland chapter president, Peter Glynn, and maybe just mention just some upcoming events. And then we'll step into the presentation from both Ciara Sheehan and also Lauren Kelly. And then we'll take some time just afterwards for a few question and answers. So maybe what I might do just before actually introducing Ciara, I might just pass it over to Peter now.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks very much. Firstly, greetings from Berlin. I'm in Berlin at the moment at the PMI Global Summit and the Leadership Institute meeting, which is taking place this week. So they're very pleased that we have really good Irish representation here in Berlin this week. First, I'd just like to say a big welcome to everyone. Thank you so very much for joining this webinar. It's really interesting to see the level of interest that we have, which is great, in the sustainability reporting and the whole focus around climate control. So I think it's a very, very important topic for the Ireland chapter, and I'm really, really pleased that we have such a high level of interest in the subject. And just a few things to bring your attention to. We have our national conference coming up that is on April 23rd in the Convention Centre in Dublin. And I would highly encourage you to attend. It's going to be a fabulous day. The whole theme of the day is around how to work smarter and the theme around AI. And we've got a fabulous lineup of speakers involved. And certainly we're looking at numbers of in between 250 and 300 on the day. So I would highly encourage you. It's a fabulous day of networking. It's a fabulous day of learning, and it's a great investment of your time. So I highly encourage you to attend. And that's taking place on April 23rd. We also have a separate webinar coming up, which obviously Agile is a very important topic to the profession. And I'm really looking forward to having this webinar from Paul Gardner in EY. And that is taking place on the 2nd of May. And again, I would highly encourage you to take part and to attend this. It'll be a really good one. Just that we've obviously had two webinars this week. We had the launch yesterday of our new construction community of practice. That went really, really well. I'm absolutely thrilled with the level of interest that we have and with the level of interest that we have in our upcoming activities. And we've had a fabulous level of interest in today's webinar. And I'd like to say a very big thank you to Ciara Sheehan. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And maybe just for the very last of the shameless plugs, we'll just for people to note, really, so we have the second webinar of the year for this community of practice. So we've booked that in just on the 13th of June. Again, similar lunchtime slot. So we have David Shaughnessy from EY, who's going to be speaking about ESG digital solutions and the sustainability digital transformation area. It actually would have a very logical flow from today's session. So again, we're trying to space these events out throughout the year. There's a few more events to come, but this is the next one in the series, and it is now up on the PMI Ireland chapter website. So I'd encourage you to register your interest to that event and to get the time blocked off in your diary. Now, I'm just going to hand it over to Ciara Sheehan, who's going to give today's Ciara Sheehan and also Lauren Cahill. So both Ciara and Lauren work in EY's climate change and sustainability services practice, and they're really kind of heading out an awful lot of the climate change strategy and development work, but this is obviously have particular interest to project managers who are going to be taking some of these strategies and looking to implement them in the future, but also in the area of climate risk analysis, because this is going to be a key driver of risk logs for project managers going forward. So Ciara, thank you, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks a million, Tom. So first, just checking, can everyone hear me and can you see my slides?
Can
Yes,
indeed, yeah.
getting some nods. Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining. My name is Kira, and Tom actually did a wonderful introduction for myself and Lauren, but I'll add in a few extra bits. I'm a senior manager on our climate change and sustainability services team, and supported by Lauren, who'll also introduce herself in a moment. But just to give a bit of a sense of the type of work Lauren and I do, we're predominantly across advisory services. And as Tom's already outlined, that includes climate related strategy work, but it also includes quite specific projects from life cycle analysis to greenhouse gas emission accounting and other areas. But largely at the moment, the big topic and the question everyone's asking about is actually sustainability reporting and what does that look like? Because for the first time ever, it's really being mandated and it's really been driven from a regulatory perspective. So a lot of the work Lauren and I are doing at the moment is focusing in on what the regulation means, how are companies preparing for it, and supporting companies. But I think the big message from today's session that I don't want anyone to lose sight of is that yes, we're right now in this compliance driven space where everyone's trying to prepare to report, but actually in that preparation process, there's quite a range of initiatives, processes, policies that are going to need to be established to achieve compliance, absolutely. But all of those initiatives, projects, programs, as they get established and integrated into your organization, are going to need close project management. And certainly for me, while I've been in EY for several years, prior to that, I was industry side. And a lot of the work that I did in this space, yes, focused on environmental impact, social impact, but all led through a range of initiatives and projects and programs that required a lot of project management. So really looking forward to bringing this session to you today. And I'll hand over to Lauren for a quick intro and then I'll bring us straight into the slides.
Perfect. Thanks, Kira. So I'm Lauren Kelly. I'm a senior consultant in the CCAS team with Kira. As Kira said, we work across a large variety of different advisory projects through double materiality, CSRD readiness, gap analysis. I primarily support and lead out on the climate scenario analysis and risk assessments in the team. So we do that for a wide variety of sectors. We go through the whole assessment through the scenario planning, looking at how those scenarios will affect the business and how we can integrate that into their current risk management protocols and systems. So yeah, I'm looking forward to speaking about it today. Hopefully it'll be invaluable.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. Um, so as I take us through, and I'm going to do kind of, we could, I suppose, argue a bit more of the boring part. I'm going to focus in on the reporting side of things, and then Lauren is going to get into the exciting scenario analysis concepts. But just to level set us a bit and to think about sustainability more generally. And sustainability can be used interchangeably with ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. And at the moment, and as you see from the slide, the clock is ticking in the world's sustainability challenges. So there's an awful lot happening, and it's nearly every day now we're hearing about climate change in particular through our media channels. So there's a lot happening at once. And what we've noticed over the last 5 to 10 years in particular, regulation is really ramping up. And mandated sustainability related reporting has really taken a new fold and a new level, a level that we've never actually seen before, but arguably we've never also seen the anticipated effects or sustainability challenges that are coming down the tracks for all of us. So the regulation is being established to support preparation for these sustainability challenges. And I really hope that as we go through the scenario analysis in particular, that will really start to come to life. So, what's observable at the moment is sustainability reporting is complex and it is currently being mandated across the globe. Stakeholders are really starting to demand and push for transparency. Companies are being faced with significant challenges in terms of implementing sustainability reporting regulation. And assurance has now been mandated for ESG disclosures, which is something that we wouldn't necessarily have seen before. And don't get me wrong, a lot of companies are already doing it from a voluntary perspective, but now it's being mandated, which is quite new. So what you see with the illustration on screen is these are a lot of the burning questions we get on a daily basis at this point in time is, am I in scope? What do I have to report? When do I have to report? What does it look like? What is the external verification process? What's a materiality assessment? Now, while there's a lot of burning questions there, we won't necessarily deep dive regulation or I'll lose everyone's attention instantly. I'm going to give you a high level overview of the predominant one in the market at the moment. I'm going to give you a high level overview of a few others that are mandated right now. And then we're going to illustrate why scenario analysis can be really beneficial when supporting that reporting process. One other thing I want to mention, purely for the purposes of the audience that we have today and in support with PMI, sustainability is a multidisciplinary area. And what I mean by that is, I've already mentioned it covers environmental, social, and governance. If I even take mine and Lauren's team at the moment, we're a combination of engineers, geoscientists, accountants, marine biologists. We're very diverse. And the reason being is sustainability involves support from a lot of different areas. So if you think about yourself in your own company right now and starting to tackle this, sustainability can't be taken on alone. Sustainability reporting cannot be taken on alone. It is grounded in a combination of different areas of expertise working together and collaborating. So if you think about your role right now in your organization and preparing to report, and if I mention now in the next couple of slides a disclosure to do with very specific biodiversity and ecosystem services, you're not expected to know the ins and outs of that right now. But there's individuals in your organization possibly already working in environmental impact assessments when they're thinking about acquisitions or procurement agreements, or if they're thinking about operations, new sites to purchase, new areas, new ventures. So there tends to be a combination of individuals across your organization that you'll work with to prepare towards this disclosure. And again, going back to the theme of project management, it'll involve a lot of different people, and it will involve a clear, organized process to preparing to do so. So what I'm going to touch on is the CSRD. So that's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and it is broken down into ES or S standards, which are environmental sustainability standards. I'm not going to spend too long on this. We actually did a detailed session on it this time last year with PMI. But the reason I have brought it up is it's the predominant regulation facing companies across Ireland and Europe at the moment. I'll show you a timeline in a moment about when reporting requirements are coming into place. But for right now, if we just take a look at the screen that we're sharing, it is focusing on 4 reporting areas. So the CSRD, the new directive, is focusing on governance, impact, risk and opportunity, strategy, metrics and targets. There's 3 topics it's broken down into, and I've said a few times already: environment, social and governance. And then there's 3 layers of standards, and I won't deep dive that too much, but it's differentiating between the sector agnostic mandatory standards, sector specific, and entity specific. Right now, we just have the sector agnostic mandatory standards, which if you look to the right-hand side of the screen, you can see there. So there is 2 standards that are called the cross-cutting standards, and then underneath those, there's the topical sector agnostic standards. I won't read them all to you in detail, but you can see there is 5 under environment, 4 under social, and 1 under governance. All standalone standards. What the CSRD is asking companies to do is to report against those standards. Each of those standards is organized into governance, strategy, impact, risk, opportunity, metrics, and targets. And this is where most people fall off their chairs or have to take a deep breath. The disclosure requirements under each of those standards combined can accumulate up to near on 1,000 disclosure points. Combination of qualitative and quantitative. And this is something that we've never seen before at a mandated level. Now, there is a concept of double materiality. Double materiality is where you assess subtopics under each of these. So for example, if I take climate change, it is broken down into 3 subtopics: climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and energy. So a company would assess using the double materiality assessment, those 3 topics. They would assess from an impact materiality and a financial materiality. And if the topic is determined material for your organization, then you would be required to report that standard. The reason I'm mentioning this is in the context of, as I just said, 1,000 disclosure requirements. If you conduct the double materiality assessment, you may deem some of those standards not material for you in your first year of reporting. So that 1,000 could decrease to possibly 800. The reason we're bringing it up is there's an awful lot of disclosure requirements. Companies are trying to understand what's their material elements, what standards do they need to report against, what does that look like for that organization, what do they have already, what do they need to get. And there's a lot of, I would say, project teams being set up within organizations right now trying to prepare to report against this. So if we think about the timelines for CSRD, the CSRD is intended to replace the NFRD. So if there's any companies on the call here who've been previously reporting to the NFRD, which is the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, reporting is required against the CSRD in 2025 on 2024 data. If you've not previously reported to NFRD, then reporting is required in 2026 on 2025 data. Who has to report? Interestingly, with the CSRD, it has defined thresholds for large entities. And again, if we pause for a moment, this is quite new. So historically, for mandated reporting, it would typically be required of listed entities. But with the CSRD, it has indicated large entities and then applied thresholds as definitions, which is quite new. So CSRD is only applicable to an entity that meets 2 of the 3 threshold requirements. They are split over revenue, turnover, and employee headcount. Entities that fall into the thresholds would then be subject to the reporting timelines that you see on screen. If anyone has looked at the disclosure to date or the standards to date, they are extensive, extremely detailed. There is a lot more nuance and detail, I suppose, around third-party countries and elements like that. But at a very high level, companies that first meet the threshold who have been reporting to NFRD are required to report in 25 on 24, and companies who were not reporting NFRD meet the threshold are required to report in 26 on 25. Okay. Next and last regulatory slide, and then I promise I'll give you over to Lauren, who will talk about climate scenario analysis. What we have here is just a bit of a comparison. So what have I told us so far? Sustainability and sustainability related challenges are coming down the tracks, and it's ever increasing day on day. Sustainability reporting has really increased over the last 5 to 10 years, and now we have sustainability reporting mandates. So they are becoming mandatory to report against. There is a lot in the market, and we constantly get asked, what's the difference between a voluntary, what's the difference between a mandated, what's the difference with this jurisdiction and that geography, and how do we understand it? There is an awful lot in the market. So what we have on screen here is the two predominant mandatory and 2 other predominant market standards that are reported against. I'm not going to deep dive all 4 of them, but we've just spoken to CSRD. The ISSB is the International Sustainability Standards Board, and they have issued 2 standards. They've issued those at a global level, and then it's up to local jurisdictions, local countries, if they integrate them into local law. Again, not formally integrated at this point in time in any jurisdiction, subject to be finalised and transposed. Intentions are actually that will be plans and transposition plans are finalised by July of this year. So we'll have a clearer view of the countries who have expressed intention to adopt, the date by which they anticipate to have that mandated. TCFD is an extremely popular framework to report against. It is mandated in some countries, not all, but is actually largely adopted at a voluntary basis across the globe. And TCFD is a personal favourite of mine because all of the other standards you see on screen integrate into it. So TCFD really has ended up being a foundation framework for all of the mandated regulation that we've seen since. And then the GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative. That is a voluntary standard, but again, widely adopted in the market at the moment. And I would say possibly one of the closest voluntary standards to the CSRD and the level of detail the CSRD is looking for. That is enough on the regulation. The only thing that I want to call out now on this before I hand over to Lauren is, as you see from the yellow box we've indicated on screen, one thing that is similar across all of them, there's other similarities, but one thing that's particularly similar is scenario analysis. And anyone who's had the pleasure of reading any of these disclosures or standards in depth will see references to scenario analysis throughout. And scenario analysis and the process to completing a scenario analysis could really support your sustainability reporting approach in future. I'm going to pause there, let Lauren go into some of the nicer bits to do with climate scenario analysis, and then I'll come back and finish us off.
Great, thanks, Ciara. So as Ciara mentioned, scenario analysis is now a requirement under various reporting frameworks, but what is the general premise behind scenario analysis itself? So as most of us will know, global temperature change is rising year on year. Oh, sorry, I actually think someone is unmuted. I'm hearing a bit of music or something. Okay, perfect. It's gone. Thank you. So yes, so global temperature change is rising year on year, and as this rises, we will see increased climate-related impacts across the globe. So scenario analysis is typically a tool that's used to understand both the strategic and the financial implications of these impacts, and it's categorized into two buckets, such as climate-related risks, and then we have climate-related opportunities. As Kira said, TCFD is a founding framework and it provides many recommendations on how to carry out your climate scenario analysis and best practice in relation to that. It recommends taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios when performing the assessment, including at least 2 degrees or lower scenario. So typically for clients, we will look at 3 scenarios. We'll look at a low scenario, we'll look at a moderate emission scenario, and we'll look at a high emission scenario. And the graph on the right there, we can see is the physical scenarios, and these come from, they're based off RCPs, which are representative concentrative pathways. These are greenhouse gas concentration trajectories that are adopted by the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a big mouthful. And these were published in the AR5 report in 2014. So they have 4 there, and we'll typically look at 3 of those. We'll look at the RCP 2.6, which is the low emission scenarios, and this will be limiting global warming to about 0.9 to 2.3 degrees. It's a very optimistic scenario. Then we'll look at the moderate scenario, 4.5, and then we'll look at the high emission scenario, which would assume that the globe will continue to warm past 4 degrees, causing detrimental impacts. Then move on to the next one there. Perfect. So what are climate scenarios? Climate scenarios are descriptions of hypothetical but plausible futures, and they consider things such as what are the potential implications for an organization's strategy if this future scenario came to fruition. So climate scenario analysis focuses on possible future climate trajectories, but it does acknowledge that there is uncertainty in these future climate and climate policy impacts. So scenarios provide plausible projections of future socioeconomic as well as environmental changes. They can be used to identify and assess a range of potential impacts and future states under these conditions of uncertainty. And these scenarios are usually analysed under a range of different timeframes to understand the short, medium, and long-term impacts. And this is requirements under various frameworks, such as the CSRD, for example. Then we'll go into the types of climate scenarios on this next slide. So as I mentioned the physical scenarios. We have physical scenarios and we have transition scenarios. Physical scenarios are, as I said, based off the IPCC scenarios, and they describe the physical climate changes in response to different levels of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. So these come in 2 forms. They come in acute, which are event driven, and they come in chronic, which are longer term shifts in climate patterns. So examples of acute physical risks would be, flooding events, and we could look at that on different scales, such as a 1 in 50 year flooding event and that impact, or 1 in 100 year and what that impact would be, and modeling that out. It would be things such as tornadoes in some areas of the world, hurricanes, storms, anything that would have an immediate impact. Then you'd look at chronic longer term changes such as heat stress, water stress, the impacts of this. Other ones would be sea level rise, so over a longer period of time and how they would come to fruition. The other side of this is the transition scenarios, and these are based on the International Energy Agency scenarios. And they describe the policy and technology developments that are needed in order to limit the global warming. So the transition impacts that will occur as we, as an economy and organizations, attempt to keep to a net zero. What are the transition requirements for that? So the transition risks include things such as economic, societal, and political developments. And TCFD has categorized them into 4 following areas. They fall under the buckets of policy and legal, technology, markets, and reputation. And then on the flip side of that, on the next slide, we also have climate-related opportunities. So it's not all bad. So mitigation and adaptation efforts to climate change will also produce opportunities for organizations, and these will vary depending on the industry, the regions it operates in, and among various factors. But again, TCFD has identified 5 buckets where these opportunities may come into. So there'd be things such as resource energy markets. An organization might diversify the products it offers or the assets and go into new markets that it wouldn't have been in before. energy sources, how that will change to new renewables and the impacts of that. Resilience, how it will develop these adaptive capacity to respond to risks better. And then products and services. An organization may develop new low emissions products or services and create further revenue that it wouldn't have before. So I'll go the next slide. So typically when we work with our clients, we create scenario narratives that explore both the physical impacts and the transition impacts, so 2 levers. And these operate across the various scenarios. So on screen, we can see that we have 3 scenarios, and these are the high emissions, the moderate, and the low emissions. So typically in a high emission scenario, as the Earth continues to warm, we'll see more extreme physical risks. So we'll see increased flooding events, we'll see increased heat stress as the temperature continues to warm. And this is because the assumption under this scenario is that there'll be, business as usual, really, that we won't be putting in any stringent policy changes, we won't be doing carbon taxes, organizations won't be reaching net zero, they'll fail to reach their targets, and eventually everything, it will just continue on an upward trajectory. Whereas in the moderate emission scenario, the idea would be that it's consistent with IPCC 4.5. So generally, global emissions will continue to rise, but at 2040, they'll plateau and eventually they will decline. So you'd be looking at higher physical risks initially, and then as it plateaus, the physical risks would ideally be mitigated and adaptive exercises would be in place. Then the transition impacts would be kind of at a moderate point. We'd see slightly increased regulatory. We'd be looking at different countries implementing such as CAP for Ireland and implementing these stringently. There'd be advancements in resource recovery and different energy types, and there'd be an increased demand in the economy for low carbon products, services, and that would continue to reduce emissions. So the transition impacts would be kind of at a moderate level in this scenario. Then in the low emission scenario, which is the optimistic, everything goes as well as it can. So this would be, it's consistent with the TCFD required scenario for 2 degrees or lower. So there'll be strict regulatory requirements, there'll be high carbon taxing, organizations will be encouraged to switch to renewables. They would meet all of their net zero targets on time. Countries would meet their net zero targets on time, and everything would eventually, the idea would be the emissions will plateau. We'd keep to a 2 degree scenario, which is an optimistic one, but we still like to keep it in there just to show the differences. So ideally under this scenario, the physical risk would be a lot lower, but the financial kind of side of the transition risk. So there'll be a lot of investing up front, and that would be high transition costs in order to get to this net zero, whether that be switching your renewable to renewables, that investment would be needed there. So then we typically look at these 3 scenarios across 3 different timeframes. So you're looking at about 9 different modeling pathways. So we look at the 2030 for the short term, and this is really useful for business planning and decisions and such as capital allocation and how you're going to keep moving forward on these risks. Then we'd look at 2040, and again, this is just a medium, a moderate to look at both the transition and the physical impacts. And then we tend to look at a longer term. Typically that can be 2050, but for different clients, depending on what kind of business you operate in or what industry you're in, that can be out to 2080 and further. And this is a more nuanced assessment to kind of look at the physical climate impacts particularly. So how they will diverge after 2050 and what that will look like across the different scenarios. So in EY, we typically use a modeling tool for our physical impacts, and that is done on an asset by asset basis. So you'll have all your assets, and it's done 11 kilometers by 11 kilometers. We'll show you all the different types of physical impacts and how they vary across different regions. Whereas the transition impacts are typically done for the most material impacts to that organization. So they'll look different for different organizations. And they're done through various calculations, and they'll consider kind of things such as the organization's business growth, how that is going to be projected over time. They'll take into policy implications from the IEA over the different scenarios. So there's a lot of assumption based in these calculations in order to create these scenario narratives and get that financial kind of quantification element to it. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense. A very whistle-stop tour through climate scenario analysis.
That's great, Lauren. Thanks so much. And I think for me with climate scenario analysis, or even if we just take a step back for yourselves and your organization, it ultimately is a resilience or stress test. And science has advanced far enough that we now have scenarios that we can use to do that. So historically, when considering risk within an organization, you leverage your risk register, you integrate into your risk register, or historically you leverage historic financial transactions or revenues and markets, and then you use that to forecast your financial streams. But this is now, the science has advanced enough that we can actually start to stress test our own business resilience against different climate scenarios. And something that we often talk, Lauren, I think with a lot of our clients is, do you think climate is impacting you so far? And a lot of the time we get told, no, I don't think so. And then when we get into discussion, it could be, well, actually, yeah, there was 5 days last year where not a single employee could come to the office because of a storm, because of a flood. Or yes, we actually restocked an entire product line because our supplier couldn't give it to us because of issues in the supply chain from climate change. But it was never thought about in that concept. And for me, what I really love about climate scenario analysis is we now have the science to create these scenarios so that actually, say you did have to close a site. So if you look back on your last year, did you have to close a single site once because of a storm? And if you did, what was the revenue loss for that one day with no productivity? Zero productivity because it had to close. And if you take Lauren's scenarios there and you model it into the high emission scenario, that storm could be forecasted to happen nearly 10 times a year. And suddenly we can quantify what that actually looks like, because that site is now closed 10 times a year. That means zero productivity on that day. That means salaries still have to get paid. That mean, and it can suddenly be quantified and brought to life. And similarly with the other scenarios that you see on screen. So I think for me, and I'm sure I'm probably oozing my nerdiness here, I just think it's really great that we have the scenarios now to model resilience in a totally new way for how we do business and write business. But I suppose to bring us back a little bit to reporting and not get too nerdy on the topic, so I've talked through kind of sustainability reporting and the mandates and what's coming down the tracks and the range and scale of types of disclosures. And Lawrence just talked through climate scenario analysis, which can be a really helpful tool when it comes to reporting against these elements, because it will enable you, say you conduct a climate scenario analysis, will enable you to understand your business resilience better. You might integrate some of the findings into your strategy. You might integrate some of the findings into your metrics, into your targets, into your governance structure. You might decide, actually, we need to link up procurement and operations here because this is likely going to happen a few times, or we might need to bring in finance more. We never thought about this before. And this comes back exactly to what we said at the start, that project management piece, identifying early who needs to be involved. Yes, from a disclosure perspective, but also possibly if scenario analysis is in your trajectory, from a scenario analysis perspective too. And I really think the scenario analysis can provide you with a foundation of information that will then trickle in and layer into establishing the functions that you need to prepare to report, but also strengthen your own business resilience in future. So, last and final slide, and then we'll open the floor for questions. ESG reporting asks for connectivity, consistency, and coherence of financial and sustainability information. So this is something that is very new, I would say, in the sustainability reporting space, in the context that historically we might be more familiar with reporting our financial statement, certain date, certain time, always reported, audited, and so on, and then reporting our voluntary sustainability statement thereafter, or possibly at the same time. But what this mandated regulation, I suppose, sustainability reporting is now looking for is that your sustainability report either features directly in your financial statement, or the information that you report there can be linked directly back to your financial statement. So if you're making a claim in your sustainability report to do with, say, offsets or investments, that also links directly back to your financial statement, and that there's a constant connectivity, consistency, and coherence between all of it. Now, the CSRD is drafted for a lot of general users of sustainability information, but some of the others out there, for example, the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards, is really, really motivated and written for users of financial statements in isolation. So it's really pushing sustainability related information, financially quantified in terms of cash flows, performance, elements like that. So it's a really new kind of piece that we're seeing, and finance is being brought in an awful lot more into the sustainability reporting conversations, and in some cases leading the sustainability reporting projects. But as project managers on the call, I will leave that up to you to figure out who's best placed. So what you see on screen here is just some ideas around this concept in terms of reporting period, things like being consistent now with your financial statement, possibly not reporting a year later, that would be too long, a few months later or a few weeks later, thinking about consolidated approach, data and assumptions, gathering all of the data at the same time, being prepared for assurance, audit, dependency between those, and then EU taxonomy, which is a classification system for CapEx and OpEx that is part of the CSRD disclosure requirements, but we've purposely not gone into major detail on that because I think we'd have lost everyone if I went into that one too much. So I'll pause there for any questions. A lot of content, a lot of material, a lot of science, and a lot of regs. But anyone, any questions?
And maybe just to add, so I would encourage people to either drop something into the chat, or if you're feeling very brave, to go off mute and to raise your question in that way. Anthony, do you want to go ahead?
There's one question there from Rebecca Mahan. What business function would typically commission or champion the introduction of climate scenario analysis?
Good question. I'll let Lauren go first.
Yeah, great. So typically when we see it is the sustainability team within the business that is, either commissioning or champion that, but we need a lot of backing, and there's a lot of teams involved in the process. So when a project manager is carrying that out, whether that's us or one of you, they'll be involving the likes of the risk team to get that validation and ensure it's integrated into the risk register. We'll be looking with the finance team to get the, past insurance issues or any events that would have affected the business. Sometimes it can be even operations will come in. We really try to do it through a workshop-based approach, get as many of those teams involved as we can. So while it is typically the sustainability team, combined often with the risk team, have to take on kind of once the process is complete, pretty much all of the business units will be involved across the process.
Yeah, completely agree, Lauren. I think predominantly it's coming from a sustainability identified team or identified individual. Now, in some cases, sustainability identified individuals and organizations right now aren't necessarily sustainability by background, but possibly new to this role and being kind of mandated with it. And especially in the context of you guys as project managers, you may be mandated with this as the new sustainability lead. And going back to that point, if you don't understand all of the detail, that's absolutely to be expected. As Lauren has just outlined, it's bringing all the right areas of the business together with the scenario analysis in particular. You'll be strongly relying on your risk teams, your ops teams, supply chain teams, finance teams, and so on.
There's another question. Sorry, there's another question actually just in the chat. Where specifically in the CSRD is scenario analysis asked for?
So it comes across various different standards. As far as, if I can remember correctly, it's ERS 2, ERS 2 IR1, and then ERS E1 9. So it comes across both the cross-cutting standards and it comes into the environmental standards as well. So there's kind of sections within that about the potential financial effects from the both material, physical, and transition risks and opportunities. So there's quite a bit involved, and there's a few different standards it goes across. So there's various data points required across that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great point. The only thing I'd layer to that as well is, as Lauren outlined, it's across a few of the standards, but just to bear in mind, it calls out specific topics in some cases. So for example, if we think about the biodiversity and ecosystem standard under CSRD, it will specifically ask about biodiversity related risks and opportunities from a scenario perspective. So the only thing I'd flag on that one is the scenario analysis, as outlined by Lauren, can still be applied, but depending on your business and depending on your sector and your area of operations, and depending on whether or not biodiversity and ecosystems is particularly material for you, you could be a sector that actually have a lot of biodiversity and ecosystem related information to hand, and actually integrating that into a scenario analysis would be very straightforward for you. Or you may be an organization where it's actually not material for you right now. It's not something you can access data on that you believe you have any material impact on. You would still be required to disclose should it come out material for you. But when it comes to a scenario analysis perspective, then you could outline that actually at this point in time, we don't have data for it. If it's material, we are pursuing data to ensure we can assess this. If it's not material, it is something that we're going to closely monitor should it become material that we can then access the data for it.
Yeah, and that's really important when you're carrying out the climate scenario analysis assessment, and that's what we make sure we do as well, that you align it with the risk process currently in place, because that way it'll make it a lot easier for you to have that data ready and to have it aligned in order to report to whether it be the CSRD, TCFD voluntary. So it should be done as a standalone exercise, and then the reporting will be layered in after that. So if it's done correctly, it'll be much easier to do that.
Great. But there's actually a few questions that have just been dropped into the chat. One of them, it's a great question actually. That what supports are the Irish government currently offering, especially to SMEs, in particular in light of impending CSRD requirements? Because I know you were just discussing kind of what sound like large corporate entities with the various different teams. So again, the applicability to SMEs is obviously particularly required.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a range of different supports out there, and I wouldn't say not just isolated to possibly the government, but other entities associated to the government. So what we might do is maybe share some links after. Might be easier to do.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And I also think important to highlight for SMEs, the CSRD won't be applicable for certain SMEs until later on. So they won't be kind of in the first couple of waves of that. So there's more time to prepare for that. And there'll also be specific standards coming out for SMEs as well. So there's different thresholds there as well.
Yeah, great point, Lauren.
I think Colm has a couple of questions. I think he's going to go off mute and be brave.
I am going to do that. I have 3 or 4, but we'll stick to the 2 that I've outlined in the chat. Question number 1 is on double materiality. I understand that companies need to ascertain themselves whether or not something is material and then be required to report on it. What is the mechanism for that, and do they have to provide a justification for when it's not material?
Yeah, it's a great question, Colm. Double materiality is really, really interesting, but it is definitely a very intricate way of materiality compared to historic ways of doing sustainability related materiality. Historically, you would have predominantly focused on the impact side of things, whereas with double materiality, you need to demonstrate impact and financial. There is a set approach required under the CSRD to achieve double materiality. Under impact, for example, you need to distinguish impacts, risks, and opportunities from an actual and potential. And then you need to score them individually for scale, scope, likelihood, remediability. And then on the other side of things, from financial, identifying risks and opportunities, and again, scoring them for potential scale from a financial quantified perspective, but also from a financial narrative perspective in the case where maybe financial data doesn't exist, but you anticipate it would, for example, impact sales directly or other cost overheads, and a likelihood perspective. So there's actually quite a lot of detail that's required under both impact and financial to conduct the assessment to then determine materiality. Why I'm outlining all of that detail is, to your point, how do you say if something's not material? The process you apply to illustrate you've aligned to the standard is so extensive and so detailed. If something's not identified as material, you'll have a lot to back that up. So for example, in the impact scoring, if you were to apply a scale, scope, likelihood, for every single scale you score against, you apply a rationale as to why you scored it that way and a backup for it, which then supports how you can clarify why something was deemed as not material. You'll have all of your ratings, your rationales to back up that decision.
That makes sense. That was really comprehensive. Thank you. And the second one was around change management engagement. There are a lot of crossovers, I think, between project management and the fact that projects are limited in time span and they differ from business as usual operations. So obviously there is, when starting this reporting project that is going to become an ongoing BAU operation, is there a change management piece to be done before in giving stakeholders a heads up, and also after in getting wider organizational buy-in, and how is that to be done?
Yeah. Okay. I really welcome Lauren's thoughts on this one too. But my initial thoughts would be, first, understand where you're at. So understand maybe through gap assessment or maturity assessment of exactly where you're at in terms of the standards, or even taking a step further back. What do you actually need to report to, and by when? And first getting a sense of what's your current state assessment in that context, and then building the appropriate change management program to support that, because maturity levels really are varying across all sectors and all markets and all company sizes at the moment. But yeah, Lauren, I welcome your thoughts on it too, because I know it comes up regularly.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And I think it's that buy-in aspect from the different teams and people across the business is really important. So whether it be double materiality, CSRD, climate scenario analysis or taxonomy, that stakeholder engagement before, through, and after the process has been complete is really important, because it does have to be integrated across different teams. It's not going to just sit with the sustainability team and remain there. So yeah, it's a kind of an ongoing process, and getting that buy-in and those people involved from the get-go.
Great, thank you. And now we probably have only sorry, Colin. We probably only have time for another one or two questions. And I know that there's still a few more that have been just dropped into the chat. Leanne has one. Will the one scenario analysis allow businesses to align to the requirements of both EU taxonomy and CSRD?
So short answer, no, unfortunately, but we typically do the climate scenario analysis. You should be refreshing your scenario analysis. It's not a once-off thing that's done and then it's left. So what we do is we'll do the scenario analysis. We'll look at the opportunities, and we'll do the quantification and the risks, and we'll try to help clients in integrating that into their process and their risk register, and how they're going to adapt and mitigate to that. Then there's a separate exercise for taxonomy. So under Appendix A of the taxonomy, there's a requirement for, in order for your do no significant harm criteria for climate change adaptation. I won't go to which is very technical, but there is a requirement there for climate scenario analysis based on whatever activities you have come across in your taxonomy engagement. So there's a separate exercise, a follow-on one to that. So once you've completed your taxonomy, you can then tag your categories across all of your assets and and do your climate scenario across that. It won't be completely separate. There will be an overlay across them. And then again, for CSRD, there's such in-depth requirements there that it won't necessarily just be from the climate scenario analysis. It'll be looking at your financials and things like that. So it's the starting point for that. And then there's a separate exercise then to make sure you're aligned.
Thank you. I think we might just have time for one more last question. We just have something in the chat from Gareth. Which do you think is currently driving more change, regulatory compliance or seeking to capitalize on efficiency and market opportunities?
This is my favorite question. I didn't mention this in my intro, but I did actually start out in psychology. And so it's really interesting. If I'm going to not get into too much detail and get too excited about the topic, but actually from a psychological behavioral perspective, the regulation can certainly start a thinking or a thought process on it, but what's actually going to fundamentally shift behavioral change is more likely when it's going to impact you. So actually the latter of that question, so the capital gain, realizing actually there's the value that can be gained out of it, or realizing there's the collaboration that can be gained, the joint venture, the reputation. There's, when it actually starts to impact you or your company directly, tends to be when you see more of a drive or a shift. But personally, I do think the regulation mandate, while it is extensive and overwhelming, I really think it's the right way to go, because as I said at the start, once you get past that compliance tick box exercise, and anyone we're working with right now who's going through all of the disclosure readiness is coming out on the other side going, gosh, we actually are really set up now to mitigate against this. Our resilience is more aligned, our risk register is more aligned, our finances are linked. There's a lot of value to be gained out of the regulatory process, even though it feels overwhelming at the start. Lauren, anything you want to add on it?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think while the regulatory is the catalyst to it, I think it's that education piece as well. The regulatory compliance is forcing everyone across the business to understand, their sustainability impacts, and whether that be through climate scenario analysis or taxonomy. And I think it's sometimes we'll talk to people and they'll say, oh no, we don't have climate impacts, but then the more you get out, they do. So the information is there, and I think the mandates are just kind of forcing people maybe to, or encouraging maybe is the better word, to get that information out and report it, and what that will look like. So yeah, it's definitely really interesting.
Lauren and Ciara, I just want to thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. It was really interesting to hear your insights in this area. I think you've left an awful lot of food for thought, and definitely an awful lot to digest. Thank you both so much for that. And maybe what we'll do is we'll look to circulate the slides. We'll get them across to people later on. And also maybe just to say that within that, I know we don't have a slide currently with the PDUs. We'll get that PDUs issued to the attendees as well. So I want to thank everyone for dialing in, and then, like I said, a special thank you to Ciara and Lauren.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.